Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. The show is a place where we pour into the sense of who God is, who we are, and how we can live more in the freedom that He has for us every single day. Hello, and welcome to the Authentic Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and as always, I love spending Tuesdays with you, and I cannot wait to dive even deeper into this topic of power, God's incredible creation power that really is what animates everything around us, but we so often develop such a toned down version of what this looks like. And so I have a wonderful guest here to chat with me today. Her name is Courtney Lowman, and she has this incredible story really of God's faithfulness and the way that that mirrors what we find in scripture that really builds our faith for why God is trustworthy and why we can really trust Him to move in power in our lives. So Courtney, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Jill. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
So why don't you share with us a little bit about generally what you do, and then you can kind of go into the situation that the Lord was really clearly being faithful and moving in your life.
Absolutely. I have the blessing of my job, I say, is that I'm a full-time mom and a part-time speaker podcaster. So I have two young boys. They are 7 and 4, so they keep me very busy. And then I have a husband who is an entrepreneur. He owns a landscaping business, and he is, God is blessing his business and it's thriving. But of course that takes him to work a lot. And so I am able to kind of serve our family in this way. Believe me, I never thought that I would be a stay-at-home mom ever in my life. And until just recently, I'm a musician and I ran a studio out of my home, and it was wonderful, but God just brought us into this new time. And so we're kind of exploring what that looks like. My true passion is discipleship. And seeing Christians kind of understand the importance of discipleship, looking at Titus 2, looking at 2 Timothy 2:2, and understanding that discipleship is a calling that we all have to offer and then to receive. And I believe that is when we are strongest. You've heard the proverb verse, iron sharpens iron. And I believe that is a beautiful picture of me finding someone to disciple me. But then we see the Great Commission in Matthew 28. That's a command, not a suggestion, but a command to say, hey, you need to go and bake disciples. So everything that I do, I have a podcast called The Journey of Ruth, and everything that we do on The Journey of Ruth is encouraging our listeners to love Jesus, study his word, and reach others. So it's not just about the intake, but it's also about the output of discipleship. And that is really where my husband always says, do you ever get tired of talking about discipleship? And the answer is no, I don't. So we, as a couple, we just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary. And I would say that years 8 and 9 were the most challenging for our family and for I actually made our marriage stronger, but it certainly was a challenging time for us. In April of 2019, my mom was diagnosed with glioblastoma, and that is a brain cancer that there is no cure for. And so doctors said they removed the tumor from her brain. So she had one brain resection, and they said, you need to pick a treatment. Without treatment, you've got 6 weeks. With treatment, you've got 6 months to 18 months left. There are some stories of people living longer, but not many. And so in the process, God was moving them from Texas, San Antonio to Texas. My mom had a seizure. That's how we knew that she had a brain tumor. She got it removed, and their move date was 2 weeks after her brain surgery. And they were supposed to be moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. So my dad is now faced with, okay, I have a job in Charlotte, North Carolina that is waiting for me, is kind of a huge answer to prayer. My dad had been the company that he had worked for a year and a half before that had been reorganized, and they said, we have no need for you anymore. Thank you for your service. And it had been a struggle for him to find work, in his late 50s. And so here's this job opportunity, but now my wife has just had brain surgery. And we really felt as a family that God had made it very clear that they needed to move to North Carolina. And they did. They moved to North Carolina. About 4 weeks after they got there, mom started experiencing some of the same symptoms, and the doctors found another tumor in her brain, double the size this time. But in that process of moving, they hadn't had time to start her treatment yet. So that's how fast this brain cancer was growing. They did a second brain resection, and then she began treatment. And my mom was able to be with us for 16 months, which was a blessing for us. We enjoyed every second. But her diagnosis was in April of 2019. And my husband, in August of 2019, we were pursuing as a family a job that he had gotten a degree for, had always dreamed of doing. It was like, when you talk to people, oh, this is what he's preparing for, people will go, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Like that job was like made for him. And without reason, he was fired from the job. There was a misunderstanding, but it was a law enforcement job. And so when you are at the beginning of that time, they don't have to give you a reason. They can just say, no, we're not interested anymore. And that's what they did. So he was getting ready to graduate from an academy on Thursday, and he was fired the Monday before. So everything all of a sudden in our family was completely upended. So not only were we dealing with this really extensive diagnosis for my mom, but now all of a sudden the direction that our family was going was, like, you talk about a door. It wasn't just a closed door. It was a slammed door in our face, and we were halfway out the door already, and we were so confused. And at that point, it had to be like, okay, God, I don't get it. So my dad loses his job a year and a half before. And my parents' description was that God had never been so silent, they felt, in their prayer life and in their conversations with him. My parents are, I'm a PK. So my dad was a pastor for many years, and God has always been very responsive to them. And he just wasn't saying anything. And then there's a cancer diagnosis, and then there's a cross-country move. And now my husband loses his job. And we're like, what is going on? What are you doing here? And then a few months later, there's a worldwide pandemic. At this point, we're like, sure, why not? God, just throw a pandemic in there. That's fine. Perfectly fine. And while the rest of the world was thrown into turmoil, we were already so much in turmoil that it didn't, to be honest, it didn't faze me, I think, as much as some people, because we were already in turmoil. And, I was talking to you about talking with God and saying, what are you doing? I talked with them about my parents and said, what are you doing there? Why are you not talking to them? And God is really honest. He literally said to me, Courtney, it's none of your business. I don't have to tell you what I'm doing in your parents' life. Right. And so I continue to pray for them, but didn't ask for any wisdom on their position. For me, though, he kept bringing in verses from Exodus. I'd listen to a podcast and there'd be a story about Exodus, or there'd be a verse from Exodus at church. And I'm like, really? That's where you want to direct my Bible reading time right now, in this time when I feel like I am totally lost. You want me to go to Exodus, to a people that are like walking through a desert. It makes so much sense now, but then it didn't. I was like, I don't get it. And he did. He led me to Exodus, and there was so much comfort that I found in the story of the Israelites, so much direction that I found. One of the biggest verses that led me there is found in Exodus 20. And this came from a podcast, and someone said it, and I literally, it was like one of those moments where I like had to stop and go, do you know what I'm going through? Like, it felt like it was like straight for me. But it's the story, Exodus 20 is where you find the 10 Commandments. And then at the end, Moses is going up on the mountain, onto Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is surrounded by storm clouds and thunder and lightning. And the Israelites are afraid. And they're like staying as far away as possible because they're scared of what's going up there. But Moses walked into the darkness because that's where God was. And I thought, is that what you're asking me to do? Is that what you're like, here's the darkness, here it is. And I need you to like surrender to walk, like giving into this moment, because I need where you're going to be. This, and then I've talked to other people, they're like, I get it. God met me in a way in my darkness, in my diagnosis, in the loss of a child, in my a diagnosis for my children, the loss of a job, the loss of a home. He met me in a way that he never had met me before, because I was a different person in that darkness than I was in the light. And Exodus seems like a weird place to go for comfort. You know, people are like, oh, Psalms or like Philippians or whatever. But God's like, I need you to know the hard truth. I need you to see how I was really honest with my children. And I need you to know that I love you the same.
I love that story so much. And I think that time in Exodus is, and like you and I talked about before we started recording, it's so interesting when we have the benefit of the hindsight, hearing their story, reading their story. And there's such an element of like, just calm down, everything will be fine. You know, the wonderful verse from Exodus, like, God will fight for you if you would simply be still, you know?
Absolutely. Yes.
And so there's all of these places where we are just so tempted. I think personally, I'll only speak for myself. I'm so tempted to judge the Israelites for their lack of trust in God. But so often I turn around and do the same thing. And I think that it's really interesting in the conversation around God's power to talk about him meeting us in these dark places, because I think that that's where people want the power to show up in the opposite way. Like they want the power to show up in terms of removal of the darkness. Thank you, God. You know, now I'm good to go on my weary way, which he can do. That is obviously within his power to do, but so often that's not how he ministers to us.
Yes, no, that is absolutely true. And I think one of the beautiful things that you see, if you read the full story of Exodus, is you see like these little tiny ways that God protected these people. And because they didn't know where they were going or what they were doing. I mean, all they knew was that God was pulling them out of slavery, you know, in Egypt. And sometimes, man, they really weren't, like, they were kind of whiny as a as a generation. But then again, they were being pulled from what they knew. They were many generations in to slavery. That is all these people knew. They knew it sucked, and they knew that it wasn't fun. And they knew that God was going to deliver them, because that was something that was promised many years before. So anyone who knew, and that was, the Jewish tradition passes down their stories through, one generation to the next. They knew this was a promise, but then it's basically like you get out of what you've known, and now you're in the uncomfortableness. And now you look back at even a hard situation, and it's like, okay, you threw me into the ocean and now I'm floundering out here. I kind of want to go back that direction where we were. And they say that a couple times. You brought us out here to die. We'd rather just be in Egypt. Really? You'd rather be in slavery than like out here where God is leading you towards the promised land? And it is really hard. It is really hard for us, just like the Israelites, to see where God is trying to take us. And for me, it wasn't until August of 2021 that I felt like I was no longer floundering. I was actually driving back from visiting family in Las Vegas, and I almost felt like this ability to breathe deeper. And then I was crying, driving down the highway, crying, not great, but it was a thing. And so but it was 2 years before I felt like I don't know, did it mean that we had everything figured out? No, because a bunch of things changed within the next couple months. We didn't have everything figured out, but I felt like, I don't know. I don't know if I felt like we were finally out of the chaos of grief, the chaos of the unknown, or if maybe it's a balance of that. And I was finally learning to give in to some of the control that we had to give up in that process, because I mean, we thought we had everything. My husband, we're like type A personalities. I have no idea what's going to happen in the rest of my day. I'm not good at scheduling. But I do have a direction in my life, and I'm going to go towards that direction. And what we experienced in the last 2 years was like this, I don't even know what's around me. And I mean, I guess you see that in the story of the Israelites, in the fact that they didn't know where they were going. And God was like, I want you to follow this pillar. And it's smoke by day and it's fire by night. And they're just going to follow the pillar. And then once they built, at the end of Exodus, once they built the tabernacle, then anytime that God settled on the tabernacle, it was time to stay. But as soon as his presence lifted, and it was in the form of a cloud, as soon as his presence lifted, it was time for them to leave. Middle of the night, it was time for them to leave. Middle of the day, time for you to leave, because God's presence is moving and you need to move with it. Because if you don't, if you stay where you're at and God's moving and you're like, cross your arms and say, no, it's the middle of the night, I'm tired, I don't want to move, good luck. So I think it was, maybe I had also learned that, okay, when God is moving, and when he shows a change in direction, we have to be okay, because wherever he's taking us is better than where I'm at.
It's so interesting, because as you were talking, I really felt this strong correlation between the analogy of like brothers at arms, right? Where we talk about when people serve in the military together, there's just this like level of trust that is just beyond what can be developed in any other situation. And it's so interesting, because it seems like that's almost what the Lord is inviting us into going into these very dark places where there's just a level of trust in that battle that cannot be developed any other way. And so it's not about desiring the harm for us or desiring anything negative for us, because we, fully believe that he works all things together for good for those that love him. Amen. But at the same time, so often the thing for our good is the increased trust in him and the ability to go deeper with him that transforms everything that comes after it. Because like you talked about, you have these 2 years walking through this very, very heavy darkness with the Lord, that when you come out of it, there's this new level of trust where I think it's, I would guess that in the future, that threshold has been raised to where there's a lot more capacity for trust in the Lord because of the things that have gone before it. And isn't that interesting how that is so often how he reveals his power?
Mm-hmm. And I have to be reminded that it, in the story of the Israelites, they were able to look back. The whole point of the Pentateuch, right? Yes. The first 5 books of the Bible is Moses wrote them so that the Israelites would not forget, because we are people and we're so easy at forgetting. And he's like, no, I need you to remember the faithfulness that God has shown and how he provided for us and how he fulfilled promises. And I think you do see the people, working together, walking through these things together as a culture. And then Moses says, now that we are in the promised land, we have to keep telling our kids what God did, because you were there. I was there. And sometimes it's really hard to talk about the struggles, right? It's hard to talk about when there was a portion of us that decided that we had a better idea and God swallowed them up. It's hard to talk about some of the struggles that we went through as we were going in the desert for so long, because we had made a mistake. God didn't want us to be wandering in the desert, but he was disciplining us. And it's hard to talk about the fact that we lost an entire generation that did that, because God saw that the hearts of that generation were hardened. And he was like, well, if you won't do it, I'm going to go for the next generation. And I'm going to make you wander around in the wilderness until our next generation is raised up and ready. And so those things that you go through, the hard things and the good things, I think it's important to make sure that the next generation knows, so that they are prepared to see God's promises. I'm not a journaler, not great. I have friends that are so good about journaling, and they look at mine and they're like, okay, so Courtney, you have a journal entry, and then you have a shopping list, and then you have like your kids, like a story about something your kids did. And I'm like, I know, please don't. It'll just make you want to cry a little. But when it comes to journaling, I think that's one way. If you have one way, for me, it's my podcast. I get to like recount what happened that week. And I hope that one day my kids will get to go and listen to the podcast and say, oh, I love this story. I'd forgotten about that, and kind of have that be like a way that my kids can remember what God did in our life, who their mom was. But when we walk, you're right, when we walk through these things together, we want to make sure that the next generation knows the way that God has been faithful. And we want to make sure that we remember when God is faithful. God got these Israelites through, they get to the sea and they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to die. The Egyptians are right there, and God splits the Red Sea and they go through. But then I'm talking verses later, they're complaining because they don't have enough water. And they're like, oh, we don't have enough water. And now you brought us to this place called Mara. And you brought us here to die. Once again, it's one of those moments. And the water here is bitter. And what they don't know is the very next place that they're going is a place called Elam. And it's a place where I don't know the number, 12, 13 springs. It's an oasis is what it is. That's where they're headed. God knew that. But they look back and say, this situation that I'm in right now is awful. And, oh, I've forgotten about how you just got me out of that pickle I was in on the other side of the Red Sea. I've totally forgotten about that. And when we are in it together, sometimes that community that we have actually is beneficial, because they can go, hey, I know you're in a really bad position, but remember how God got you out of that other one? Do you not think that he's faithful enough to get you out of this one? I feel like that answer I just gave was a little convoluted, but that idea of like, yes, when we go through struggles with people, it is important to have those people around us so they can remind us of who God is. And then we must remember to let the next generation know what God has done for us.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite images from the Old Testament about that is from Joshua 4, where he's opened the Jordan this time, and they take the 12 stones from the riverbed and they set them up. And I always thought that was such a powerful image, because obviously it's all through the Old Testament to, carry the story forward and let the next generation know and things like that. But I loved the concrete of that, and there's several other examples of using stones specifically in the Old Testament. Yes. But they even say, put these here so that your kids will ask about what is the reason that these stones are here. And so we actually have a journal in our shop that's called My Memory Stones. And it's set up the same way where you just have a 1-page journal. It's kind of for people that don't necessarily like to journal. So this might be a good for you. Where it's just, on each page, it's just, what was the situation and what did God do? And it becomes this personal record of the faithfulness of God that we really need our own testimonies a lot of time. That's part of why I jump at all the opportunities that I have to give my testimony, because every time I hear it, even though it's my own story, I'm like, holy cow, like God has done all these really cool things.
Yes.
So many of our podcast listeners know well the miracle of the diapers with my first child, where we literally could not afford diapers for this baby we were open to life, but we were also kind of like, but you were supposed to live up to your end of the bargain here, Lord, and really, make this happen when the time was right. And we didn't perceive it to be right at that time. And due to the generosity of all of the parents at the middle school where my husband taught and made very little money, we did not buy diapers until our second child was almost 2 years old. And it was just wild how at the time there's always two ways to look at these things, right? You can just be like, well, it was just a bunch of generous people, it was just a one-off, and just use the word just a whole bunch of times around these things that happen, and really don't allow the fullness of what God is doing and the way that he uses other people, like you're talking about in discipleship and community, to really be his hands and feet in the concrete way that he's inviting us into as part of the church, to bring about these things in our life. And so to really look at these circumstances and say, this was the Lord, whether or not it was like fire from heaven, this was the Lord that put it on these people's heart to do this for us, that moved someone to say this thing to me, that brought about this, unexpected financial blessing, whatever the case might be, to really be clear in our minds about where was the source of that.
I think that's so important to remember where it comes from, because it's really easy, like you said, to just be like, oh, like it just happened, or yeah, it was this really cool thing, and we just always had food. But to recognize, my husband said something really interesting. He said, America doesn't often understand desperation, like we as Americans. And that desperation is sometimes the place where God can show his power in a really mighty way. And the Israelites in Exodus were desperate. I mean, they were desperate to get out of Egypt, and then they were desperate to see this promised land. And then they're desperate to get there faster than they're supposed to. And I think we are all, we have like a direction that we're going, but we have to remember those times when we were desperate. And we have to remember the times when God was faithful. In other countries, desperation is just like it's an everyday situation. Literally, it's moment to moment. And my desperation is, am I going to be able to feed my babies? Whether, you see countries in war, and those mothers are desperate to find a safe place for their babies, wherever it might be, whether that means staying in their home or leaving the country. And I think it is so important for us to remember that desperation is not a bad thing or something to be forgotten. It's something to be remembered. And then the way that God brought us out of that desperate situation is something even more worth remembering. And I love the idea of journaling those moments, because it allows you to practice thankfulness in a way that it can be so easy to just be like, just pray for the things we need, and not recognize the way that God is providing for us every moment of every day, and to be thankful for even the small things that he gives us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Courtney. It's been such a joy to talk to you about all of these things.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. What a wonderful opportunity this was to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. It is always a joy to be with you. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whichever place you most prefer, or do it all if that is what floats your boat. We would love to continue to get to know you better and grow in relationship with you. And so I encourage you to check out the links in both our show notes and our YouTube description that tell you more about where you can connect with us elsewhere. The two big things we have going on besides the podcast is our shop that is full of reminders of who you are in God, helping you to really grow in that radical art of standing in who you are and giving gifts that help others to do the same. The other big thing we have going on is the Uprising Academy. This is all of our formation programs, workshops, retreats. Everything is available virtually and on demand, where you can sign up and continue to learn more about radically standing in what God says about you, especially if you are in a place in your life where you are not being fed the way that you long to be fed. Whether it's in your community, whether it's at your church, whatever it is, there is more for you, and we can absolutely walk with you into it through the Uprising Academy. All those links are in our show notes, and if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to leave a review. Reviews are the number one way that we help get in front of new faces, new people that are able to be touched by the radical art of standing in what God says about us. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you have an amazing week.